Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. Today, we have a very interesting topic dedicated to a very interesting day. First of all, we would like to thank S.Friedman for being with us weekly. Also, giving big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to ask our questions and give your feedback. We'll definitely address them in the end of the next session. And also, the questions from the previous session will be addressed today. So, Stephen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali, for the introduction. As always, thank you for your ongoing participation in these talks. I also obviously want to extend my thanks to the American Consulate in Almaty, to Elmira, Dana, the entire team, the entire staff that provides this platform for exploring philosophical perspectives on a broad range of topics, often, as I've emphasized, tied into international days of celebration or recognition. That is true of today's talk. Turns out that April 23rd, tomorrow, is World Book Day. So I thought that would be an appropriate topic given how important books have been in my life, in the development of any philosopher historically. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm mostly going to focus upon passages, as I often do, from the books of Joshua and from Phalaris's Bull that provide an autobiographical account of my involvement with books, their importance in terms of promoting the philosophical development of my ideas, of promoting the philosophical enterprise. And I'll also be referencing how some of those moments, occasions tie into broader philosophical concerns. The actual title of today's talk, "And Then I Met a Book," which is a line from Phalaris's Bull. It's actually one of the favorite lines of my producer of that play in the entire work. The work itself, Phalaris's Bull, is about 10,000 words. It has lots of lines, but that was one of his favorite and one of mine. I've quoted it in the past in different contexts. I'll quote it again tonight in its appropriate context in due course. I first wanted to make some general remarks. When I was at orientation as a freshman in college, there was an assembly where one of the principal administrators of the school of Harvard College addressed the assembled incoming students. And he explained to us that professors in principle were accessible to us. Harvard had a relatively small undergraduate student body, that we shouldn't be afraid to approach them. We shouldn't be afraid to seek them out. But he emphasized that in general, most of the professors at Harvard, maybe broadly, were more comfortable around books than around people. And so he said, fundamentally, the initiative would be ours. It's not that professors would be disinclined to speak with us. It's just that that's not their area of greatest comfort. So we were encouraged to take the initiative. One of the people that famously was vastly more comfortable around books than around people was Isaac Newton. There was a documentary on his life that I saw many years ago, in which one of my professors from Harvard in the history of science was one of the main contributors to that documentary. But another professor who studied Newton's life, his work extensively, noted that He was a man who was not ever really comfortable around people. It was books that mattered. And of course, it's not the physical object, right? It doesn't matter whether that book is existing in a physical space or a virtual space. When I was young, obviously, I acquired physical books. At the moment, they're not here. They've actually been in storage for a number of years, but I'm thinking of retrieving them. And if I do soon, this entire wall will be lined with them. There were several thousand books that contributed decisively to the germination, of my intellectual results. We are lucky that Newton was as obsessed with books and their ideas as he was. I make the point, and again, we can't do the controlled experiment, and these are the kind of points that I'm going to be constantly referring to, that when we make various types of historical claims, judgments, speculations, they're heuristic. They can never be rigorously validated. We need to come to terms with that broadly and deeply. It applies to most of the contingencies of our lives. And much of our suffering, in fact, one could argue all of our suffering relates to our failure to appreciate that. That's one way to explicate the ultimate source of human suffering, the sense that we imagine seeing the world from the outside. We imagine that the logic of this world is fundamentally different than it is. We live conceptually within heuristic spaces where any two things are approximately equal, but existence itself is epistemic and marked by radical distinctions, point by point. I've quoted often the line from Shakespeare that Wittgenstein had been tempted to use to introduce his magnum opus, his ultimate masterwork, the Philosophical Investigations. I'll teach you differences. That's the nature of rigor. Rigor is of difference, and it is rigor that is the philosophical enterprise. It's exploration and application widely. But as a heuristic point, and whenever I make a historical loss, it is heuristic. And I've emphasized also that the most important thing to address for any issue, any concern, is whether it is fundamentally epistemic, rigorous, non-challengeable, incontrovertible, in the nature of a philosophical proposition, or not. And if it's not, then it's heuristic, it's not rigorous, it can't be ultimately validated, but it can be used to achieve a particular result, an object, a creative object, a technological object. Well, it can be argued heuristically that had Newton not had his obsession with books, the majority of us would never have been born. That without that obsession, we likely would not have had a scientific revolution. Without a scientific revolution, we likely would not have had an industrial revolution. And if you say, well, someone else could have supplied what Newton ultimately gave us, not necessarily, not at that level. I've emphasized that Archimedes was slain against orders by a Roman soldier during the siege of Syracuse. Archimedes is considered the greatest mind, the greatest mathematician of antiquity, one of the three greatest mathematicians generally who ever lived, along with Newton and Gauss, the German 19th century mathematician. Well, Archimedes was doing work in the early stages of the development of what will become calculus in modern mathematics. His death interrupted that development. The individual that was able to continue it, fulfill it, didn't arise for 2,000 years. And that was Newton. And Also Leibniz, independently of Newton. But again, two preeminent minds that arguably took 2 millennia to emerge. So Newton's relationship to books is decisive in the forms, the developments, the direction in which modern society has taken. I began my association with books from a very early age. It's referenced almost at the beginning of Phalaris's Bowl. A couple of lines. My parents and grandparents read to me constantly until, as if by magic, by the age of 2, I was able to read. The Little Engine That Could was my favorite in bright colors, sunlit. Here's what The Little Engine That Could, that children's book, one of the most famous of all children's books, at least in this country, looked like. I have some images here I want to show you. As always, and this, I'm trying to be a little better in bringing these up as we talk about these ideas. So there is the little engine that could, a blue engine against a yellow ground sky. It was about perseverance, the little engine that could succeed despite everything that seemed to be contending against his efforts to ascend a hill, ascend a mountain. It's the lesson of perseverance. That lesson of perseverance is central throughout culture. I mean, we have lots of illustrations of its importance. There's Churchill, during World War II. Never, never, never surrender. There is the famous admonition of Silicon Valley. Just when you're at the point of giving up is when you're almost there, right? And these are not just moral injunctions, moral guidelines. They are grounded ultimately from a philosophical standpoint in the rigor of our circumstance. Namely, no matter what we've experienced in the past, no matter what anybody else has experienced in the past, rigorously, any difference, any distinction between a past attempt and a subsequent attempt, between our attempt and someone else's effort that might have failed, any such difference is rigorously a decisive difference and can lead to success where there have been endless failures in a particular endeavor, a particular direction previously in the past, right? It's the principle of the battering ram, right? That we continue to exercise the battering ram against its object, against a wall, against its door, until it succeeds. Every time, the famous admonition, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, is insanity, something that I still continue to hear almost on a daily basis, somewhere, in some media outlet, in some writing, it's referenced constantly. Well, it doesn't apply to our world. It doesn't apply to our reality. It doesn't apply to philosophic reality. It doesn't apply to the reality that philosophy reveals to us. It applies to heuristic space, where any two things are approximately the same and so can be approximately equal. Remember, I always reference this formulation, this sort of logical mathematical formulation of my philosophical work. A heuristic space is one in which there is identity. Two things can be equal, but only approximately so. From the standpoint of rigor, from the standpoint of epistemic reality, E, where any two things are rigorously distinct. in epistemic space, in our existential reality, we can't do the same thing repeatedly. And the fact of the matter is, every movement towards mastery, towards mastering anything, mastering an instrument, mastering a language, mastering philosophy, mastering whatever the endeavor, the enterprise is, amounts to repeated efforts that ultimately will give a different result. The fact that mastery is possible at all through repeated application attests to the epistemic reality of our circumstance, that any 2 points are rigorously distinct. That ultimately is what explains that time-related formulation. Past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. The past cannot guarantee the future rigorously because of any distinction between past and future. So, again, we want to be aware fundamentally of the true nature of our circumstance, and the true nature of our circumstance always justifies persistent effort to achieve a new result, such as that of the little engine that could. So even at a young age, at the age of 2, that lesson sort of made an impression on me. Not an impression that I could have articulated, obviously, at that point, but a lesson that stayed with me and became more clearly distilled, formulated, rigorously distilled in my more mature work. A little bit later, as I approached, that was at the age of 2. When I was 6 or 7, I was in the 2nd grade, and there's a little passage in Phalaris's Bull that deals with another important moment in terms of my relationship to books and in terms of the development of the philosophical work. That is, in a quote, "My 2nd grade teacher made reading books a competition, and I found myself reading to win. One day, she called my mother in to talk with her. Why? Had I read too much? Not played enough with friends? Did I have enough friends? Maybe I really wasn't normal." Well, that afternoon, my mother sat me down to explain what they discussed. I don't remember the details, but that night, I had a realization that I do remember. Probably the most important of my life. That what my mother was getting at, what the teacher was getting at, was that I had a gift of mind, strong enough that I couldn't ask for anything more. Not money or fame or even more toys. And that it wasn't about me, but that it had to be used in the best possible way. Well, for a number of years after that, the question was, what was the best possible way to exercise what was now clear to me as something unusual? Because people kept referencing it. For a long time, it was science that engaged my interests, my efforts. One thing that did not, and this relates to the importance of books in my development. Well, when I was around that time, actually, my father bought me a chess set, a beautiful, simple wooden chess set that I loved. And he taught me how to play. Now, my father, as I've referenced elsewhere, wasn't highly intellectual, not highly educated, did not go to college, but he knew chess and he liked chess, and he explained to me the rules of the game. I played with him a little bit, but I mostly played by myself, against myself. I was an only child, and a lot of games, that people would play with others, I found ways of playing alone. And I found that challenging. Now, it might sound a little bit odd, but actually, another documentary I saw not too many years ago was about the chess master Bobby Fischer. Maybe one of the greatest chess players in world history, certainly one of the greatest chess players that the United States has ever produced. And he noted that when he was young and developing his skill at chess, he played by himself, against himself. And when I saw that, I was like, yes, that makes total sense to me. That was how I preferred to play. The other thing that was interesting was that I didn't, unlike somebody like Bobby Fischer, somebody who went on to make chess a career, I didn't study the game that much. I was a very intuitive player. So I had cousins who were much more committed to reading books on chess, which I never recall doing. I don't think I ever bought a book on chess. That was one area that I didn't explore. But I would play against cousins who were much older than me. Some of them were adults. They were attorneys. They were educated. I was very young. But I always won. And I won, I think, for a very simple reason. I knew nothing about strategy. I had not read the books on chess. I was playing against these individuals that did know the books, did know strategies, did know opening moves and gambits and sequences. They were always, I think, they were spending a lot of energy trying to figure out what I was up to, like what category, my approach fit into. And the answer was no category. I was just doing it intuitively. It's often said, I don't use chess a lot for metaphors of my philosophical work, just because, again, it's not something I was committed to for a long time. And I'll make a point about that in just a second. But it's often said that chess masters see ahead 10 moves, 20 moves. I'm not sure that's quite true, and I'm not sure that's even necessary. My attitude always was the most important consideration is what the next best move is, based upon the current configuration of pieces, which again relates to my philosophical sense that we are experiencing, coming to terms with the world from within, and that our current circumstances are decisive and reveal to us everything we need to know, that there's nothing fundamental that will come from our perspective from Mars. What we need to understand about the nature of the world, about the nature of existence, is it's available on Mars, but it's just as profoundly available right here, where I stand. And if it's not available right here, then it's not available anywhere. And whatever the formulation is that captures the reality here will apply everywhere. That's the nature of philosophical aspiration. That's the nature of its generality. And that ultimately is the nature of rigor. But I did not commit myself to chess, ultimately because I saw it as a game. And not that one can't learn valuable things from games, and that's a point I want to make a little bit further. But if I was going to engage intellectually with some activity, I wanted it to be not about a game, but about the world. If I was going to study something, I didn't want it to be strategies in chess, though that could provide insight. I wanted it to be theories in physics or things about just the fundamental nature of reality, not limited to a game. The game might provide metaphors, but that was A game was not going to be my main focus. And so very early on, I shifted from playing games by myself to reading books because I wanted those ideas and I wanted the access, the perspective that books provided on the nature of what we're dealing with. Again, not yet within a philosophical context, just in terms of a general inquiry into the nature of our circumstance. And so I was assisted by parents that, even though they were not highly educated, not intellectual, my mother didn't even graduate, was from England, and did not graduate high school, I don't believe. So she had a limited education, but she was smart. And she had a strong sense of things. And so did my father, have a strong sense of things. Like in my father's eulogy, for example, it's a little bit off track, but I want to say it as long as it comes to me at this moment. In my father's eulogy, I referenced a comment that he made towards the end of his life when I was reading some of my philosophical writings, some of my manuscripts to him. He said to me, "Stephen, I can't claim to understand your philosophical work, but when I hear your words, I see blue skies and fresh fields." Well, that's as deep an understanding of my philosophical work, its significance and its implications, as I have ever heard from anybody. So, my parents, even though they themselves were not highly formally educated, they gave me opportunities. They bought me books, and they let me buy books. And there's a passage in Phalaris's Bull that addresses that. My parents bought me books. At 8 or 9, it was Tom Swift, a teenage engineer with flying submarines and missions to Mars. After reading all 25 titles in the series, I'd rush to the store for the next to arrive, but it became too long a wait, and I moved on to the Library of Science, a book of the month club for the latest college textbooks in math, physics, psychology. I remember a physics textbook when I was 10. The first paragraph took me a night to read. I still didn't understand, but I persisted, and each day the pages got a little clearer. Before long, relativity and quantum mechanics had become intuitive. And there's a major lesson there, right? The value of persistence, the notion that every time we revisit something, we're not revisiting the same thing, we're not doing the same thing. We are different in some way, and any way in which we're different could be the decisive way that leads to a decisive understanding. So I was never afraid at a young age to encounter things that were beyond my age level, beyond my understanding, written for a college audience, written for a graduate school audience. I didn't care. Even it didn't matter if I understood every word. It didn't matter if I understood every word as a graduate student or as a professor might understand that word. All that mattered was that repeated visitations, repeated exposures provided me with greater and greater understanding and clarity, even if it was very incremental. The most important book, though, so there was the Library of Science. That was decisive because that was giving me exposure to college textbooks in a whole range of subjects. And doing that kind of reading at a very young age is, again, I was doing it because I was self-motivated. There have been examples historically. John Stuart Mill is one of the famous ones where parents, fathers, intellectuals would create an educational program that had the goal of achieving mastery at a young age of sophisticated subjects, but it wasn't always or typically under the initiative of the child. John Stuart Mill is a significant philosophical figure, but it's been noted that Bertrand Russell, a relative of his, was the greater intellectual figure. Bertrand Russell's work was more self-motivated. John Stuart Mill's creativity may have been compromised by the demands that his father placed upon him at a very young age. I did not have those demands. I read, I explored at high levels of sophistication just out of my own interest. And if I didn't understand, I didn't. And so I might come back to it another day or go to something else. But as important as the Library of Science was, around that time, around the age of 11 or so, my parents bought me something that would prove to be equally important, equally decisive. I don't have it here to share, but I'll tell you about it. They bought me a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, today, everything is online. One can satisfy any level of intellectual curiosity online. That was not the case when I was younger. The best comprehensive source in sort of a finite number of volumes, a relatively compact, and here's actually where it is. Let me just show you this. Oh, here is an example of one of the Tom Swift books, Tom Swift and His Flying Lab. These were the Tom Swift books, actually, were really the only kind of young person's books I ever read. I didn't read a lot of child literature. My parents read me things. I don't know what those books were, except for The Little Engine That Could. I read the Tom Swift books, young adult literature. And then after that, I was mostly reading nonfiction, mostly reading science, math of various kinds. But here is what the Britannica, it was 24 volumes. It came in a bookcase just like that. I had virtually the identical looking bookcase, and that was it. And each volume was about 1,000 pages in very small text. I don't know if you can see that. That was like one page. There were over 1,000 of those per volume. The range of subjects that were covered was exhaustive, right? It was meant to cover everything. And that, when the Britannica was being produced in those days, it was first of all recognized, at least in the English-speaking world, as the greatest of all encyclopedias, compendia of knowledge, right? When those editions were being assembled, they would go to the editors of the Britannica, would go to authorities in whatever field they were going to have an article about. So if it was physics, they approached Einstein or the equivalent. If it was psychoanalysis, they would approach Freud. They went to renowned authorities, celebrated intellectuals, people that had demonstrated mastery of the subject, often had created the subject. They had those people write articles, for the encyclopedia, for inclusion, and they would be virtually unedited when they became part of the completed Britannica. They might have been edited for minor issues of grammar, but basically they were not edited by a central committee of scholars, of editors, that would aim for uniformity in style. So there was a wide range of styles that one encountered. Every author represented, whatever the article was writing in his or her own particular style. And it was seen as an honor, to write about your subject for the Britannica. So often the people that were contributing the articles would craft their pieces so that the essence of the subject was distilled at a high level. So a lot of these articles were extremely sophisticated, well beyond what an 11-year-old could reasonably be expected to assimilate. And they were largely beyond me. That didn't deter me, right? As I mentioned before. I started at A, and I started reading through article after article after article. After a little while, I thought that was a little too mechanical, so I would jump around. But every day, I would come home from school and I would read articles in the Britannica. I might read about Mozart, I might read about modern physics, read about Einstein, read about something in geometry, read about Napoleon, about the history of the United States. And these articles often ran many pages. I think the article on the United States and its history ran over 100 pages. So these were virtually self-contained works of a comprehensive nature on each topic that was addressed. Well, I didn't read the entire Britannica, but I read a great deal of it. And at the age of 11 and 12, when you're doing that, you are stimulating your mind, right, at a level that you really can't achieve in any other way. So that was decisive. Now, when I was doing that, turns out there is one of the most famous of American film franchises, it's internationally famous, is the James Bond franchise. And the first James Bond film, Dr. No, came out around the time that I was reading the Britannica. Okay, I went to see the movie with my father, and I was young. What I most remember from that film, and it still is vivid in my mind today, there was a woman, an actress, Ursula Andress, who played, what's referred to as a Bond girl. It's kind of a sexist, right, term. It's not considered appropriate, now to refer to that category of actress. But what stood out about her was that I don't know, she was from the Caribbean or something in this film, and her father, I think, had died, but she had a set of the Britannica, as this character is relating. And to educate herself, she began at A and read through the Britannica. So it was remarkable to me to have that kind of reinforcement, in a film that some character was doing what I, in fact, had already begun to undertake. So that told me, well, this seems like, a judicious approach to learning. That is an example, by the way, of convergence, right? That not an accidental coming together, but a reinforcement, right? Convergence theory says that the more convergent elements that assemble at a point, the stronger the object at that point. Now, that's not, that is a philosophical gloss, really. But remember, philosophy really deals formally with the structure of epistemic space. Everything else is heuristic, but by clarifying the distinction between the epistemic and the heuristic, it clarifies the nature of convergence. And that is an example. So that reinforced, we can say, my commitment to what I was doing. And I continued to do that for a number of years. In Phalaris's Bowl, around the age of 12, I refer to an important encounter that gives this talk its title. And the passage begins, and I've recited this in the past, and then I met a book. Science and the Modern World by Alfred Whitehead. The title told me it was science. I was wrong. Whitehead was an early 20th century mathematician and philosopher. His book, Difficult Philosophy, some say among the most difficult ever written. I read it on the bus back and forth to summer classes in math and computers at Caltech. On those bus rides, I began philosophy at 12. Everything else would be easy by comparison, even philosophy at Harvard. Now, there's an example of the advantage of encountering something difficult at the beginning of a process. If one, again, doesn't give up prematurely. I read that book. I don't remember. Now, by that time, honestly, I'd been reading a great deal in the Britannica, for example. So I was reading at a sophisticated level. So it was possible, as I recall, to read Whitehead with reasonable understanding. But the value of that was partly that it introduced me to a work at a high level of sophistication, so everything else felt easy in philosophy. The other thing, of course, is that it taught me lessons early on about the nature of generality, right? And about something that I have referred to repeatedly. Whitehead's remark early on in the book that stood out when I first read it. I think I remembered it virtually instantaneously, and still remember to this day the idea that, and I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit, I haven't looked back at the book itself. Oh, and I've shown this before, but here is, let me just show you, here is Whitehead, Alfred Whitehead. He was a professor at Cambridge and then at Harvard. And here's Science in the Modern World in the actual edition that I read. If I had my books here, I'd be able to take that off one of the shelves and show it to you. It would look just like this. Whitehead made the remark early on that what matters most decisively are circumstances of such great generality that no one ever sees them, because they are always right in front of our eyes. And that is, as I think you probably have got the sense by now, central to the philosophical enterprise, the nature of my results, right? That the epistemic, the ultimate reality that we need to come to terms with for a whole range of reasons, including the fact that it does represent the ultimate reality, it does clarify everything else, and it is liberating from all of our entanglements, all of our illusions, all of our delusions, ultimately all of our sufferings. Well, that's right in front of our eyes. Another thing that became a formulation of mine that goes back to Whitehead in a sense is the notion that what is most profoundly important in the nature of a solution is that the world is different in different directions. Something as obvious as that, that's obvious to all of our eyes, and yet we don't note it. We're not aware of its significance. Its significance is that a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible, that the logic that ensnares us is the logic of heuristic space. That is not the ultimate incontestable reality. Heuristic space succumbs to the greater analysis, the deeper analysis of rigor. Okay, so now I make the transition to philosophy, and I began reading, and I'll get to this a little bit later. I began reading things on the borderline between philosophy and the sciences, philosophy and physics. What I want to show you a little bit later towards the end is a page on my first website where I list readings that I think are central, to my philosophical development, and so could provide people with an avenue into a deeper understanding of my work. But let me make a philosophical comment about that. The path that I am illustrating is a path that we can't do experiments to analyze and evaluate, right? The important thing that we fail to understand about our circumstances endlessly is its fundamental singularity, right? We can't, for whatever path or decision we make, go back in time, do an alternative direction, take an alternative path, and compare outcomes. The books that I read, I can't ever say were the best books to achieve the end of philosophical understanding. Another path, another direction might have been just as effective, might have been more effective, might have been less effective. We think we can make these comparisons because we think in terms of heuristic space where two things are approximately the same. But the nature of our existence does not permit those comparisons rigorously. So you need to take all of my experiences, all of my readings as heuristics. They're possibilities. You might find illumination by reading Alfred North Whitehead, but you might find illumination, greater illumination, by reading something else. You might find greater illumination in your particular case by reading a book on chess strategy, right? We can't ever do the evaluations. The fact that we cannot do those evaluations is more important in terms of the ultimate nature of our circumstance than thinking that we need to be able to make those assessments. It's one of the most important of all philosophical points to recognize. The nature of our circumstance is grounded in its singularity, in the impossibility of a rigorous scientific logic which is comparative in nature. And that, as we'll see, and I think I'll address this a little bit in the questions at the end, when we have a theoretical impossibility at the core of a methodology, that opens the possibility to developing other methodologies, other heuristics that are even stronger. And that is what convergence theory represents in relation to science. Science has a flawed logic. The controlled experiment that it relies upon is theoretically not rigorously validatable. So we can use it, but there will be something stronger that will be able to be implemented more decisively with more powerful results. Convergence theory was what led to some of my cancer results. It's something that I will be exploring with you, in subsequent talks, actually. But once I began reading philosophy, I became involved with reading systematically. I've always been given to that. When I discovered English literature, I went to the beginning and I started reading Chaucer and then Shakespeare and then chronologically through the English literary tradition. The same thing when I began reading philosophy. There's again a passage in Phalaris's Bull. Let's see. Let me find what that passage is. I want to make sure I... Okay. It's actually from the books of Joshua. The time had come to read the sum of West. It's actually both places, actually. I quoted from the books of Joshua in Phalaris's Bull to give a poetic element periodically. The time had come to read the sum of Western philosophic thought, to discover what had been tried and taught, from Plato to Aquinas to Descartes to Hume, Kant and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein to consume, and everyone in between, before and after, were the authors I tried to master, as deities start counting tears in the early teenage years. So the early teenage years, 13, 14, maybe 15, those years. And notice I gave a chronological progression. That was how I proceeded. I've always found that chronology provides additional information, contributes to understanding in its own particular way. When I assemble books on aphorisms, publish books on aphorisms, in general, I preserve the original order in which those aphorisms occurred, with very minor alterations for certain logical developmental issues, because I want people reading it to benefit from the actual nature of the sequence. It's not arbitrary, even if it's not always apparent to me, why the sequence has the form it does, because a lot of my philosophical work germinates subconsciously beneath the surface, and then kind of comes out in a more or less fully formed aphoristic style, but only subsequent to a lot of thinking. I've sort of often explained to people that one of the reasons why I write aphoristically is because each aphorism might take 10 or more pages to fully explore and develop. If I have 20,000 aphorisms, that's over 200,000 pages of philosophy. Nobody has ever written, or nobody is ever likely to read so much discursive philosophical writing. So I rely upon the concentration of the aphorism as a distillation and as a communication. And I rely upon talks like these to give a broader context to provide understanding. It's raining. It almost never rains in Southern California, but it's raining. I didn't expect that. Okay. And one thing about that, when I was from an early age, certainly at this point, when I was in high school, when I was in junior high school, I was sitting in class reading these philosophers as much as anything. I was at an early point writing philosophical essays inspired by like my reading of Hume. So my engagement with these readings was not passive, right? And I recommend that as a path to mastery generally, that I would try to sort of assimilate what I was reading and then develop my own sort of work in directions where the readings did not seem fully satisfactory, or where the readings seemed to leave questions still open. But again, it was an interactive process. It wasn't that I was just reading books and assimilating information. It was that I was engaging with the books. It's another illustration of convergence theory, that the greater our engagement, the greater the intensity of our engagement, the greater the frequency of our engagement, the stronger the object that results. The greater the convergence from different directions. I didn't just read one author. But keep in mind too, that by the time I was reading philosophy with a certain single-minded purpose, I had read a great deal. I'd read a great deal in the Britannica. I had read a great deal of a lot of different subjects. One of the least effective things one could do in coming to terms with philosophy is just to read philosophy. There's a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher I've referred to before. I referred to him in Phalaris's Bull, Protagoras. He's famously noted for the remark, the aphoristic remark, man, humanity, is the measure of all things. But he also said, to do philosophy, you must know everything. Well, you can't, right? But the point is, everything in principle applies. Everything is relevant. Books on chess strategy apply. Just one doesn't have time to read everything, right? But that's never to say that any particular avenue of approach, any particular book is not relevant to the ultimate purpose, the ultimate philosophical enterprise, because philosophy addresses everything, is concerned with everything, is illuminating everything, and so is in principle illuminatable by everything. Freud, early on, apparently had wanted to be a philosopher, but he abandoned the pursuit because apparently he didn't feel he was gifted at mathematics. Well, in order to do philosophy, you have to be able to do mathematics. You have to be able to do virtually everything. Or you're going to be biased. You're going to be approaching the subject from a certain preferential direction where philosophy demands a universality of approach because it is engaging in a universality of application. So the most important, I think, lesson today in terms of my relationship to reading into books is the breadth of it. Yes, at some point I did focus upon the Western philosophical tradition and then Eastern philosophical writings, the tradition of India, the tradition of China, but I was also open to the histories of countries. I was open to art history. I was interested in, whatever the subject was valuable in terms of the philosophical enterprise. The thing that is least valuable is a focus just on academic philosophical writings. Certainly, if one wants to advance the field, one needs to fertilize one's efforts from lots of different directions in order to be true to the admonition, the guidance of Protagoras. Now, we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip. I'm not going to do every single thing that I had planned. I never do every single thing that I've planned. I always overplan. Just in case I run out of topics. But one of the things that was decisive in terms of, again, my relationship with books, with reading, and with not so much the form of my philosophical education, but with the form in which the philosophy would ultimately be written, was my encounter with Shakespeare. Prior to a visit that I made to England when I was in my late teens, like 17 or so, I had not read a lot of literature. I had read a lot of science, a lot of math, a lot of philosophy, even things like history, Herodotus, Thucydides, but not so much literature, not novels, and not much Shakespeare, except what we were taught in English. So maybe I had read Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar, but not with a passionate commitment, to the writings. I've told this story before. I'll tell it again. I went to England and I stayed with an uncle. My mother was British and came from a large family, so she had a lot of brothers and sisters. The first week I was there, and I was staying there for 3 months, I started leafing through a magazine that my uncle had on his dining room table. And I came upon a perfume ad. The perfume ad contained a quotation from Shakespeare. Turns out that at that time anyway, some years ago, Shakespeare was often represented, used in advertisements. Samuel Johnson, that great English man of letters, was used a lot. But this particular quotation from Shakespeare, and again, I've recited it before, from King Lear, the same play that produced I'll Teach You Differences, was her voice. It's about Cordelia. It's eulogizing the king's beloved daughter, one of Shakespeare's most beloved characters. Shakespeare writes, her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. The sound of that struck me. Some of the imagery of it, but especially the sound of it. I've emphasized that for me, poetry is about sound. My writing, my aphoristic writing, is as much about sound as the concentration of meaning of content. Well, I'd never read anything so beautiful, it seemed to me. That opened the door to Shakespeare. That opened the door to English literature. That opened the door to me to the sound of the language. Prior to that, I was reading for intellectual content. I was reading a lot of things in translation because I was drawn to the ideas. I read Dostoevsky in translation. I read Tolstoy, Turgenev, Pushkin. I read all of Camus, mostly in translation, even though I'd studied French in high school, so had a little bit of access to Camus in the original, other French writers in the original, but mostly in translation. The German authors, Goethe, Schiller, the German Romantic tradition in translation. But now I was exposed to the particularities, the uniqueness of the sound, that a translation can never fully quite capture, certainly not at the level of Shakespeare, to my experience. From that point on, my focus was on reading English literature where I could. Now, fortunately, English has one of the great literary traditions, one of the richest literary traditions. And so I was able to read Chaucer and all of Shakespeare. I read all of Shakespeare, every one of his 37 plays, all of his sonnets, all of Shakespeare. I tell people that before one writes in English, one should read all of Shakespeare. It was something that I was committed to doing once I understood the power and the beauty of his achievement. And most importantly, it taught me about the structure of an English sentence, the cadence, the sound pattern that was effective, that was central to Shakespeare's writing, the equilibration of monosyllabic and polysyllabic words. And that became central in the design and in the writing of my aphorisms. And the concentration of Shakespeare became a fundamental motivation for me to write in the aphoristic style I eventually adopted. Shakespeare, men must endure their coming hence even as they're going hither. No, men must endure their going hence even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all, from Hamlet. Well, my aphorisms, incontrovertible solves the world. Existence resolves to salvation. Those have a Shakespearean sound. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Again, the basic sound structure is Shakespearean, not an accident. So Shakespeare contributed. Now, the aphoristic form of writing was central in the history of philosophical writing, sometimes by accident, because a lot of ancient Greek philosophers survived only in fragments, individual aphoristic expressions. We don't know if they might have been part of a longer, more discursive work, but we have Heraclitus most famously writing aphoristically. But When I began writing philosophy, very quickly, the aphoristic form, partly formed by my experience of Shakespeare, became dominant in my philosophical expression. From Phalaris's Bowl? Oh, the encounter with Shakespeare is captured poetically. Magazines show scenes of where a nation leans, and what they choose to quote can be an antidote to sagas learned by rote. Even in a perfume ad, catering to a current fad, Lear can go mad. And when he does, Cordelia comes to mirror what he was. And when she goes, the king still knows her voice was the song of the rose. Poe is sonorous in his woe, sufficiently so to substitute for the mandolin and lute if we are astute as Joshua and follow suit, that poetry is sublimity, preferentially mute. As the notes Beethoven couldn't hear still penetrate and sear, and Cordelia's voice, soft, gentle, and low, answers the mad King Lear. So that's the kind of music, that's obviously my poetic writing, but not purely philosophical writing, but that music infuses my aphoristic philosophical writing. There's an account of that. Let me just give it to you quickly from Phalaris's Ball. When I started writing philosophy a few years later, and I wrote first paragraphs, but within 10 pages, aphorisms, concentrated statements, verbal mathematics. The riddle of the world is an object. God is a skeptic, generating time. The style of Heraclitus and Pascal, Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. Powerful, lean, intemperate, uncompromising, suffocating, urgent, definitive. A style for a moment of death, when everything must be concentrated into a few vital and redemptive words, because there is no time, as there never is at the moment of philosophy. The point is that at extreme moments that I experienced during the earthquake, when it seemed that my life was about to end, I was about to be crushed under the weight of a falling building, moments of emotional stress, extreme emotional stress, when I found out I had been adopted, when I lost my last family member, my father, and so now I was alone. I had really no family because my father was an only child, I was an only child, my mother's family was in England, so remote, and at that point, all of her brothers and sisters were deceased as well. So for me, philosophy has to address those extremes, and it's something that the aphoristic form is given to, in the sense that one wants everything distilled into a few words at a moment of demand, challenge, crisis. Philosophy has to be strong enough on those occasions. That's my demand of it, and it always has been, like a switch to address whatever the challenge, the extremity of the circumstance is. It actually relates to something that had struck me when I was reading in Hindu culture, Hindu philosophy, the belief that whatever thought was running through one's mind at the moment of death would determine the nature of one's rebirth. And so people, as they lay dying within Hindu culture, would be reading through appropriate passages from the Bhagavad Gita, so that something elevated would be going through their mind at that fatal moment. Well, I wanted my philosophical work, my aphoristic work, to be able to rise to those occasions of extreme demand. Hence the aphoristic style. Now, I've mentioned Encyclopedia Britannica, it turns out there is a section in the Britannica, an article on literary style. And one style that they address is the aphoristic style. Just to give you a sense of the nature of the Britannica's writing that I was experiencing at a young age, I'm going to read you a few sentences from the article on aphorisms in the Britannica. And let me make sure we're up to date with the images. Yes. Okay, so it's about a page, and we see that the Britannica pages are long, so I'm just going to read you a few appropriate sentences here. Authors, and again, this is aphorisms within the article on literary style in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Authors of maxims and aphorisms, on the contrary, strive for the brevity of inscriptions on metals and public buildings and for a diamond-like resistance to the devastation of time upon diffuse and padded writing. French prose writers, including Camus and Malraux, scattered through their prose works striking aphorisms that summed up the sense of a situation or the experience of a lifetime. The form, even more than poetry, represents the most economical means of communicating long experience. When for imparting moral advice, in a very few words, or at most a few lines, an aphorism may enclose enough matter for the plot of a novel. If Epictetus, Pascal, and Nietzsche had expressed their reflections consistently and systematically, their works would probably be forgotten. Nonetheless, as Pascal shrewdly remarked, the aphoristic prose style is, of all the manners of writing, the one that engraves itself most lastingly in the memories of men, of human beings. So, for many reasons, again, it's an illustration of convergence at work, right? Because when we are writing, even if we're writing philosophy, we're writing within a heuristic space. We are assembling. We are bringing together words, and that process of bringing things together is a convergent process that is, again, playing itself out heuristically. Whenever we attempt to describe epistemic space, we are describing it from the outside. Epistemic space itself, rigorous space, is aconceptual. Remember, concepts cannot arise within it. This is a representation of heuristic space. Those circles represent conceptual groupings, things that are similar based on family resemblances, chairs that look roughly the same and can execute similar functions. Epistemic space looks more like this, where you say, well, don't all those points look the same? Yes, but they're all distinguishable. And they're distinguishable by their location with respect to the edges of the page. That's enough to establish the epistemic. Distinguishability of any fundamental nature. Okay, I want to show you something. I want to read something. I mentioned earlier that my first website, normalism.org, is what I called it. It's a long story. I won't go into it now. I did about 23 years, around the year 2000, 1999 into 2000. I actually had not had a computer before. I bought a computer for the purpose of creating a website. And I created this website to begin communicating my philosophical results. So I designed it entirely myself in a day when there weren't that many easy applications. I had to teach myself some HTML. I did it, right? Because the lesson of my history of reading is one of perseverance, right? One keeps on trying, and ultimately one will achieve the result. If one doesn't achieve the result, one keeps on trying. That's the nature of heuristic space. One cannot know in advance that something is theoretically impossible within heuristic space. A rigorous logic does not govern it. So, here's what this page looks like from my website. I think you can see it. Each page was a different color. This one, I guess you can't really see, was all yellow. There's an image there, that's a pastel of mine. The image on top, the pastel, and there's an image, it's hard to see, on the other side, where how I navigated through the site. So when you clicked on different regions of the images, it would take you to the next page, a previous page, the directory, and so on. That's how the site was designed. I did it that way. It was kind of designed almost like an artwork, right? Here's what that page is devoted to, and I mentioned this earlier, the readings that were important, in particular, in the development of my philosophical work, and that I recommended to people visiting the site if they wanted greater insight into the sources of my ideas, and if they wanted to kind of position themselves to approach my work as I developed it. So, it goes, and some of this I've already mentioned in terms of Protagoras. The comprehensive nature of philosophy, hold on, I have to read it from somewhere else. It is not, that image actually is just a partial image. So let me go to where I wrote it down. Okay. The comprehensive nature of philosophy demands experience and cultural exposure, right? That's why one has to read, and read widely. Protagoras, one of the most eminent in the circle of pre-Socratic Greek thinkers, maintained that to do philosophy, you must know everything, right? Not possible, but you have to try. And you have to try with commitment. The result, in other words, not as a tourist. If you're reading a work on sociology, read it as if you intend to be a sociologist. Then you'll be able to assimilate it to the degree that will allow you to apply it in the development of a philosophical understanding. The result, very few philosophers, which is perhaps in many cases a blessing, but not in all, and these are what matter. Listed in roughly the order in which they were read, these writings strongly influenced the early development of the philosophy. Other works by their authors are valuable in themselves and for more background. They are not easy, but as Spinoza remarked, to end the Ethics, his great work, the Ethics, everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. So, the works, Alfred North Whitehead's Science in the Modern World. I've discussed that on many occasions, including today. Hans Reichenbach, The Rise of Scientific Philosophy. It's a book that actually I moved in a totally different direction from eventually. His thinking was that contemporary philosophy had to be infused with scientific understanding and methodology. It's actually the opposite, that science stands in need, in desperate need, always from the critique from a higher level of rigor, the rigor that only philosophy can provide. That's why philosophy created science. That's why philosophy is able to create convergence theory and other methodologies that go beyond some of the logical limitations, the theoretical impossibilities of scientific methodology. Rudolf Carnap, Philosophical Foundations of Physics. Again, we see how I was working early on the boundary between physics and philosophy. That was my transition. Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, my movement into existentialist thought. I was about 14 when I read that, 13 or 14. I read it in a bookstore, actually, in New York. Soren Kierkegaard's diaries, I've mentioned Kierkegaard, emphasis on the individual, considered the first existentialist philosopher, even though he didn't distill it as it's possible to distill it now. the sense that we cannot view the world from the outside, that the fundamental source of human suffering is the belief that we can in fact view the world from the outside, that there's a reality that we are observing as if we were the author of a novel writing in the third person. David Hume, A Treatise on Human Nature, that for me introduced me to the nature of the problem of time, of how the past cannot guarantee the future, which summarizes really what Hume was addressing. Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. Kant, along with Aristotle and Wittgenstein, for me, represents one of the three greatest of all philosophers, even though, again, a lot of his results I no longer quite embrace. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, I've talked about that repeatedly, and Malraux's anti-memoirs as well. I've addressed that repeatedly. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things, but we're going to run out of time. Okay, at some point, when I was reading extensively, especially, and at some point when I was writing my own philosophical work, I reached a point where I couldn't really read much anymore. I would go back and read, I never quite finished Brothers Karamazov. I've read most of the other novels by Dostoevsky straight through. I was reading Karamazov. I actually visited Niagara Falls, left it in a motel there. A few years later, I bought a copy of it, but now I'd been writing philosophy. I was about 1/3 of the way through Karamazov, and suddenly I was almost, and I've never had this experience with another writer or another book, inside his mind, where I knew what he was going to say next. I knew the next paragraph. I knew the next paragraph. I stopped reading it. Now, that is an experience that I've had not quite in that way, but ever since I've written extensively myself, I will pick up a work, and from the opening paragraph or the opening sentence, I can get a sense of what its assumptions are, what its presuppositions, what its strengths, and what its limitations are. But that's just because of how extensively I've read and written, especially my own work. At some point, I reached the stage where the only person I felt I could read profitably was Picasso, who actually fancied himself a poet more than a painter. And he expressed himself aphoristically. Some of his aphorisms are on my mind constantly. Aphorisms like, it takes a very long time to become young. Anything original, anything genuinely worth doing can't be appreciated. People simply don't have that much vision. Computers are useless. They only give answers, and so on. Okay. The book that was, in the end, probably a springboard to my actual writing of philosophy was André Malraux's Anti-Memoirs. And it was a springboard in the sense that it was a book that Malraux famously said dealt with the questions death raises about the meaning of the world. I did not feel in a position to write works on my own until I felt I could come to terms with the questions that that book was raising. When I began developing my own sort of philosophical responses to those questions, that's when the aphoristic writings began to emerge. So for a very long time, I felt that until I could answer Malraux in some meaningful way, there is no point to my writing anything. So my philosophical work, for me, attests to formulations that deal with questions of the nature of death, the response to our circumstance from the deep nature of our reality, our fundamental existential space in which concepts ultimately vanish as they vanish in mystical union with God, to give a religious metaphor. Okay, That will be it. I think I can't go any further. So let me deal with the questions. Again, I need to devote more time to these questions because these are excellent questions. And I will be dealing with some of these questions in my next talk, in fact. But let me just hint at answers. These are excellent questions. Okay, the first question. What kind of philosophical issues or questions are popular for scientific researchers and international relationships between Kazakhstan and the USA? The most important is what I keep on addressing that I don't feel is yet satisfactorily addressed anywhere, and that is the fundamental limits of scientific methodology that opens the possibilities for more powerful methodologies, convergent methodologies to be developed and to be applied. It's important that I find that within the scientific community, the fundamental nature of the controlled experiment, the fundamental nature of the comparative process, the fundamental limitations of that process, the nature of heuristic versus epistemic space, not deeply, sufficiently, profoundly appreciated. This, in particular, the United States is not a philosophical culture. Right? That's why the Harry Potter novel, published around the world as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, was published in the United States as Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is rigor. That is the power and the promise of the philosophical enterprise, that it is able to reveal the limitations, the presuppositions of our undertakings that, in the case of science, allow us to feel entrapped by a scientific result. We need to understand more deeply, more profoundly, that scientific methodology is something to be used heuristically, not something to allow ourselves to be used by. So, a much deeper understanding of the nature of scientific methodology, its limitations, the nature of the logic, of our existential space, and the nature of the operational logic of heuristic space and how convergence operates. Science is really a convergent enterprise that is attempting to compare points that it's not going to be able to compare rigorously, and that becomes its limitation, that becomes the opening for other avenues to explore. And then, quickly, what other fundamental lectures would be useful in developing the Kazakh philosophy? First and foremost, addressing the question of what philosophy is as the limit of rigor. I find that that is not well understood anywhere among any professors of philosophy at any universities that I've encountered, not to that level of distillation. And then understanding, well, my next talk is going to be on philosophy is freedom. That relationship in terms of that religious admonition, the truth shall set you free. Well, the truth that achieves that is rigor, philosophic truth. That's the Philosopher's Stone. And then the application of philosophy in every direction, to our understanding of our circumstances, to the nature of decision-making, to the nature of judgments, to the nature of our judging of others, to the nature of the structure of society and the role of those structures and their grounding. So basically, the nature of philosophy itself as the limit of rigor, and then how that applies and illuminates and clarifies the nature of everything else. Okay, I know I ran through that quickly. I will, though, those are important issues to address, and so I will be addressing them next time also, okay? But that's a bit of an introduction to it. Okay.
Stephen, thank you very much for the talks and thank you for the questions. And thank you, the audience, for joining. And we see all the likes, all the feedback. And I would still like to read out some of the questions. Irkan, thank you for joining us weekly. He's an active participant.
Yes, I appreciate your presence always. Thank you so much. And your questions. They are extremely valuable questions. Thank you.
Yirkin writes, "Good day, Professor Stephen Friedman. We're glad to see you again." Then Yirkin again writes, "How do you think? What is the main difference of the US philosophy?" Then what are the main modern philosophical questions or issues of the US? And thank you very much for interesting interpretation of philosophy through classical books. Thank you very much, Irkan. We'll definitely address your questions in the next session. So one more time, we would like to give big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General, to American Space Almaty, and also to you, Stephen. Thank you very much for being with us weekly. We're truly happy to have you, and thank you, the audience, for being with us. See you all next week, and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. See you next time. And thank you again, Aaliyah, as always. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.